sermon title is taken right out of Ephesians chapter 5. This has been sort of a pattern I've been following. There's certain key words, certain key phrases that sort of jump out of this letter that was offered to the church in the city of Ephesus, in what was a province of Rome called Asia, which is now modern Turkey. And sometimes being woken up means we have to face changes. Sometimes the way God catches our attention is when things are a little bit different. And I think we're having a little bit of that experience this morning with having sort of a change of format and a change of way of doing things. This is the last in a series on Ephesians. And the plan is that next week I'll start on a bit of a series going through Acts. So if you think of Ephesians being for a message, a way of offering guidance to a congregation that had been going for about 30 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So it's sort of taking cumulative experience and saying, here are some ways in which we can follow this particular life. Here's how we can do community together. In going to Acts, we look at how that got started. How did this way of being, this way of forming Christian community actually take shape? It's sort of the making of story in the book of Acts. Some of the themes I'm going to be looking at from chapter 5 and chapter 6, just to give you a preview, are asking the question of what is first. When we're given an opportunity to reflect about our lives together, about our lives in community, what takes priority? This theme of waking up, or of who it is that offers the wake-up call and how we respond. And the idea of mutual submission that gets touched on here in talking about life together. How do humans relate to each other? And then the passage that was just read about the armor of God. All the way through this letter, as we've gone week to week, there's always something about what is centrally important. Paul, probably writing from a prison cell, certainly was under supervision of a Roman soldier, is offering some guidance to this relatively young community of faith, this people who join together under the banner of Jesus to figure out how to live life together within this very pluralistic society. And Paul keeps coming back to remember what God has done. Remember God's love. Remember what was demonstrated in the sacrificial love through Jesus. And that's the center point for the community. That's the thing that helps people work through what it means, not just in individual lives to follow Jesus, but what it means collectively for us together to move forward together. Consistently through this letter, the connection is made between God's love for us and how we give expression to that in the way that we relate to other people. At the very beginning, these words are offered. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. This idea of self-sacrificial love, of love that's transformative because of its example, its inspiration, and also its impact, is just a reoccurring theme through all of the New Testament. But in Ephesians, it gets repeated every chapter. There's a constant revisiting, a grounding, a centering, a reminder that this is why we do what we do. The city of Ephesus was a place that offered many alternatives. There were a lot of sort of distractions in the daily life. Some of you may know from either your family's history or from relatives who told you stories about what life was like when you're dependent primarily on manual labor and on walking to get to places. I remember my grandmother at one point talking about raising a family through the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 1940s, and saying, well, we would go to the church that preached the gospel and that we could get to by sleigh in the winter. You know, your extent of how far you could roam, how quickly you could move, was sort of limited to that kind of transportation, either walking or having some animal be able to get you there. So that was one thing in and of itself in living in the first century. And that's probably a little bit more difficult for us to relate to, given that we have motorized vehicles, we have instant communication. Although right now, walking being the best way to get from one place to another is easily understandable in downtown Woodstock. With all the fences up and all the streets closed for the municipal improvements, that's sort of what we're working with right now. So I guess that part we can imagine. But in addition to the pace of life, to the needing to take things slow because that's just the way things work, there were these impulses, these sort of emphasis within the whole city that you just could not avoid. Besides the regular commerce of the marketplace and needing to make a living, needing to care for your family, needing to support the people that you needed to support, there were some predominant themes. Ephesus was a very religious city, but in the sense that that was connected to all of life. What you see on the screen right now is sort of the archaeological remains of the temple to Artemis. And so this was declared by one of the early Greek philosophers as one of the 7 wonders of the world, a massive structure. And now really all we have to go by is sort of, the one column standing of what would have been many columns under a large roof structure, all made of marble of expensive stone. And for many in Ephesus, this would have been like an identity factor, right? When we read in Acts chapter 19 of Paul going to Ephesus and talking about Jesus, there was a silversmith, so making small idols of Artemis, who became upset by this. And also there was a interaction with one of the slaves and sort of redeeming that slave from some spiritual oppression. And the cry that riled up the mob and that caused the authorities to feel like they had to step in to sort of calm things down was a cry that great is Artemis of the Ephesians. This idea that another path, another form of spirituality was actually a front, not just to individuals, but to the whole city, that this is what our identity is centered around, this is who we are. Right? So for people sort of sorting out what it means to follow Jesus, this was a challenging place. And Paul offers them several opportunities to reflect on priority in their lives. It's interesting as you start to move through chapter 5, how Paul frames what can be considered idolatry. Right? So this is a city where literally there are temples, literally there are statues of these different sort of spiritual powers that people would offer worship to, would sacrifice to, would conform to what the practices were. And it's interesting some of the things that Paul sort of pegs as being indicators of idolatry. So I'm just going to read those few verses for you. This never goes faster when you're doing it in front of an audience. So reading just verses 3 to 5 in chapter 5. And if you're interested in reading along through Ephesians, there are Bibles there, but also encourage you at home, you're welcome to read through and have some discussion with me. I enjoy those conversations. So starting at verse 3, it says, "But among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God." So this isn't Paul saying that God is going to kick you out. This is Paul saying, here are the distractions, the alternate paths that we can get caught down. And that would have just been part of the life of that city. People would have acknowledged those items. And just for us, it seems jarring, right? That foolish talk and coarse joking would be put up there with idolatry, of having some other God before the creator of the universe. But this is talking about, if we search deep, what are the influences that affect us? What are the ways in which those start to sort of seep out into the words that we speak, into the actions that we commit to, that start to have an impact around us? And can those actually be used as sort of an early detection system to sort of cause us to reflect on, okay, where is that coming from? As I said earlier, this letter offers multiple opportunities for people to consider God's invitation to sort of return, refocus, and recenter. Who is at the center? This approach sort of makes the issues less about a little statue as an idol and more about sort of the values and the ideas that we consume, that we make part of us, and what impact they then have on us. I used to work with a lady whose son was a young adult and trying out a career in show business. And so he was a comedian for Second City in Toronto. And I remember in the lunchroom, my coworker saying that her son was complaining to her. And he was saying, "I would have this idea for a great bit, but it was a little bit risque. And over my shoulder, Mom, I would hear your voice saying, 'Really?'" And my coworker was completely fine with being the voice of her son's conscience in those moments, and felt like, yeah, I want you to be reflecting on that. I want you to be thinking about what it is you're involved in. She was totally supportive of his career, but she was also happy that he was having those moments of reflection and review and sort of considering what his priorities are and what he wanted to accomplish in this world. The question really is not like what is first in our life, but it's who is first. How is it that our relationship with Jesus isn't just a matter of gathering together on a Sunday, or isn't just a matter of saying a prayer on occasion, but it's actually that ongoing, interactive relationship? There's interest in us and in what is shaping us. This message that Paul is offering is not the only time that the people who made up the church in Ephesus heard these kinds of themes. So one of the disciples of Jesus, John, ended up getting exiled as part of his speaking about Jesus. And while he was sort of off on his own, praying and meditating, he had this vision. And it was a vision of what Jesus would want to say to some of these new churches. And Ephesus was on the list. And so when we look at the beginning of the book of Revelation, there's this moment when John is explaining sort of this vision of what it looked like for Jesus to have an opportunity to say words to the churches. And I'm going to read what's on the screen and just want you to sort of hear not just the specific words, but some of the tone. To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, "These are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 gold lampstands. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false. You've persevered and have endured hardships for my name, and have not grown weary. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first." There's almost sort of a sorrow or a pain in that, right? There's a depth of relationship that's been lost. And it goes on, and you can read that. There's an invitation. I think I'd mentioned a few weeks ago, a memorable image for me from my childhood was being in a church that had a picture of Jesus standing at a door and getting ready to knock. And sort of that idea of that Jesus is always willing to enter in and always willing to want to sit down with us. I'm going to return back to Ephesians and read a few more verses from chapter 5, verses 8 to 13. "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. And that is why it is said, 'Wake up, O sleeper. Rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.'" It's recognized that this is really a deeper spiritual issue for humans. They use the language of darkness and light here. And sort of this idea that spiritually things are not all okay with this world. And either you are part of that, what's called darkness, something that sort of obscures things, doesn't make the truth visible, causes people to stumble because they can't see where they're going, or you're part of the light. And it's really interesting, the language here is not just that you receive the light, or even that you reflect the light. The idea is that you become the light. This is something that you have to offer. It's also important to note that as Paul is offering a guidance, advice, direction to this group of people that he had lived with for a few years, as we read in the book of Acts, it's not a self-help book. Paul isn't saying, "Come on, folks, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps." There was a funny sketch, I thought it was funny, from a long time ago. I wasn't sure if the reference would work because it's Bob Newhart, when Bob Newhart had his own show as a psychologist. And for those of you who have no idea what that is and are of a younger generation than me, Bob Newhart also shows up as the Force Ghost in Big Bang Theory and Professor Proton. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's fine. You're not missing a whole lot. And so Bob Newhart, as a comedian, has this bit where he's sitting behind the big desk in the big office as a psychologist, and someone comes in through the door and starts sharing, hurts they've experienced, what it is that they're dealing with, what they're wrestling with, the concern they have. And he says, "I want you to listen very carefully. What I'm going to say is going to change your life. Stop it." And that becomes the bit. That's all he says as a psychologist, to try and help this person who's deep in personal struggle. They just stop it. Well, Bob, if they could stop it, they would have done that before they came to see you, right? In Ephesians, this idea of Christian spirituality isn't so much that, well, we just need to step up. We need to up our game. We need to improve how we live our lives. It's talking about God actively willing to invest in us. That the relationship of trust actually affords us with power, with abilities that we didn't know we had, with opportunities to see where we could make a different choice. It's allowing us to not just be alone as we walk through life. When we think about God's care, we often think appropriately about times when we've reached a point of acknowledging that really we need someone else's help to move from where we are. And that's completely appropriate, and I've heard amazing stories from people about reaching that point. But the offer that God is making us is this can be an everyday thing, where we acknowledge who God is and who we are, and that God has a role to play in helping us to live the life that we're meant to live. I love the image of waking up. You know, when I have an alarm go off in the morning, I then respond to the alarm by getting out of bed, hopefully. But the alarm is the thing that is sort of triggering me. I'm not just from deep sleep suddenly becoming awake on my own. God's offering those prompts to us all the time, offering an opportunity for us to recognize what it means to be more alive, to be more awake. As part of the flow of living into the light, Paul does offer some practical recommendations for relationships at that time. So keeping in mind, this is first century Greco-Roman culture. There are some things that are very specific to that environment, but there's also a lot that we take because human life has continued to be human life. A variety of roles are described in Ephesians, and I'm not going to go so much into what it says about the parent-child relationship, although I want to recognize that respect is something that's very valuable in that relationship. And I'm not going to go spend time on the slave and slave owner relationship, which was prevalent within Greco-Roman culture. There are estimates that it could have been as many as 5%. And so if at that time, if the Roman Empire was around 50 million people, that was a lot of people who one way or another had been caught up into slavery. I'm very thankful to live in a time and place where that's actively opposed. We're not dealing with those issues in the same way, but at that time, it was important to explain how do you not abuse that kind of power when it's present in your community. I find the image of the marriage relationship to be really helpful. And Paul doesn't just talk like as a marriage counselor, but he actually uses it as an example of, hey, as a church, these things are important. How do you maintain relationship over time? I've had the benefit of speaking to a few people this past week who've been married a lot longer than Kathy and I have. One couple in particular, I said, hey, when you write your book, Kathy and I will buy it. So I think they're thinking about taking that on as their next project, although they might have just been teasing me. But the amount of effort it takes to nurture a relationship that is sustainable over time, through the ups and downs, through the tensions, through the stresses of everyday life, I just have a great deal of admiration and commendation for people who are able to work that out. And I know how painful it can be sometimes to maintain those close relationships. One of the issues that I'm really glad is present in Ephesians, but I haven't always heard stressed, is this idea of mutual submission. How is it that we acknowledge that there's times in which I'm hearing your voice and you're speaking God's wisdom to me, and there's times at which you acknowledge or offer that, hey, you're offering me something that sounds a lot like what Jesus would want. And we're able to offer encouragement, we're able to offer support, we're able to offer love, sometimes a little bit of direction together. Next week, Jerry Tree, who did the reading this morning, and I are going to be heading off to the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec Assembly, which is a yearly meeting where Baptist churches from across Ontario and Quebec gather together and worship together and talk together and learn together. And so I welcome your prayers for that gathering this week. And as part of the learning, they've invited Dr. Sam Reimer to speak. Sam is a friend of mine. We've had a chance to do some research and writing together in the past. I've had a chance to sit down at his kitchen table in Moncton, where he teaches at Crandall University. And Sam's been on an interesting journey because as a sociologist of religion, and as someone who's part of a church and cares about what goes on in churches, he's been doing a lot of listening. He's been asking questions of both people in Canadian churches and people in churches in England about, so what's important to you? What do you prioritize? How do you sort out how you live your life and what's important? And one of his findings, which I assume he's going to have some discussion with us about next week, is that there's a lot of people that are sort of drawn into this sort of part of Western culture that is sort of very individualistic, where we kind of each look out for ourselves. And he's talked about, where do people see authority? Are they comfortable with seeing authority coming from somewhere else? Or are they most comfortable with feeling like they are the authority? And his concern as a sociologist of religion, and also as someone who cares about the church, cares about the things that we're talking about this morning, is that there's a lot of sort of authority of self starting to come up in how people talk about what's important and how they sort out their values. And that it sort of cuts us off. It can cut us off from hearing God's voice in the midst of what we're doing. And it can sometimes cut us off from hearing encouragement or wisdom from each other. So these words, I think, even though they're 2,000 years ago in another part of the world, seem to have a resonance across those centuries. Ephesians 5, verse 21, sort of summarizes or encapsulates this concern when it says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." This morning, Jerry read for us a passage of Scripture that's very common. I think it has sort of a great visual appeal because it talks about this armor, and we can sort of picture in our mind what that armor might look like. Probably for the people who lived in Ephesus, this would be like a Roman soldier they would be envisioning, because across the Roman Empire, you could always see Roman soldiers. That was the way they sort of established their control. There's a very visible presence across the many countries that were sort of enfolded into the Pax Romana. So, my understanding of what this means is that they would be issued sort of a standard uniform. That's one of the ways in which the Roman Empire had their presence, right? Is you could identify immediately, okay, there's a Roman soldier here, Rome is watching. And so this actually goes piece by piece through different pieces of the uniform and describes, well, you can do this too. On a regular basis, on a daily basis, you can intentionally pick up the pieces that you need to move through life, that you need to wear to represent who it is that you're representing. All right, so it talks about putting on the sandals, the foot gear, of the gospel of peace. It talks about putting on the belt of truth. I've heard someone joke that, if the belt's not there, other things are going to come apart. If you don't have that integrity, if you don't have that ability to embody truthfulness, what is that going to mean for the rest of your life? It talks about picking up the shield of faith and the sword, which is the word of God. So those both have sort of defensive purposes, and the sword also sort of points to, it cuts through, it helps to establish authority. The breastplate of righteousness, of being in line with God so that when there are things that are damaging you, you have that. You know where you stand. And the helmet of salvation. So knowing that you know who it is that you're connected to, what it is God has done for you, how God has loved you, what it means that Jesus died for our sins, gained victory over death, and then was resurrected and seeks to guide us now. There's two things I want you to think about in this image. One is that we don't manufacture these things. These are things that God provides. And the second is that these things are for our benefit as well as for the benefit of people around us. So the common Roman soldier would not have made their own gear. They would have this given to them. And similarly, we don't manufacture our salvation. No matter how good we are or the wonderful things we do, we can't sort of earn these pieces. This is something that God offers as a gift, and we choose to pick them up. Jesus is the one we acknowledge as our righteousness. It's not something that we can create or fake. Is something that we can choose to live into. If we're centered on who God is, then righteousness is something that we develop. One of my friends who've been in ministry a long time, I was talking to him about how in his Christian tradition, holiness was a big theme. And he said, my definition of holiness is that we're doing a little bit better than we did yesterday. That some of these things are a process of living into. And these things are for our benefit as well as the people around us. One of the patterns as you read through this letter, if you ever read through it, all 6 chapters, I'd encourage you to do so. It's quite interesting to see how the pieces kind of fit together. But one of the patterns is that Paul often sort of states up front, here's why I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. So I'm taking sort of a step back before the description of the armor, just to read to you verse 12, and then we'll skip forward to verse 18. So when Paul's explaining to them why this is important, he writes, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." So Paul situates this as being a spiritual issue. Here are the ways in which we can have a positive spirituality, be protected, be able to offer something to the world around us by engaging in these kinds of practices. I worked for 15 years for the Salvation Army, and prior to that, I'd worked for 4 years for Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. And there's some people who I knew well, and they knew my history, and that I worked for a number of different groups in Canada. And they asked me, so how does that work out? Because Mennonites aren't really big on military, but Salvation Army has army in its name. And so this was usually where I went to explain that to them, that for the Salvation Army, everything that they do is spiritual warfare, because it's opposing the things that are opposed to God, and it's seeking to support the things that God would want to have happen in this world. So, for example, a lot of Salvation Army folks, they're more about action than about words. But some of them, when I get to talking to them about how they reflected on what they were doing, they say, well, like reducing poverty is actually a form of spiritual warfare for us. Because poverty can actually create scenarios that are really hampering and oppressive for people. And so if we can do things to help people see hope in the midst of poverty, that's actually a spiritual act on our part. Right? So this is something that we can actually think of quite broadly in terms of what it means for us to be spiritually engaged. When we're offering hope that Jesus has another way, this is part of what we're doing, is giving people a sense of, okay, that's a future that I could step forward into. In many ways, when we gather, we're actually sort of modeling what that could be for people. I did a research project where I talked to folks who'd immigrated to Canada from a country that was dominated by another religious tradition. And the questions I had were about, so how did you encounter Jesus after you came to Canada? And it was interesting, of the people that I interviewed, a number of them said, well, I had this experience of a church. And I realized for some of them, it was sort of a testing out. What does it look like to enter into this new community life? For some of them, it was a big ask because it would create complications in their previous community where they'd lived before they came to Canada. And for some of them, they said things like, well, I didn't know the language, but I experienced peace when I entered into this group of people worshiping together. Right? So this is part of how we offer this together. It's interesting with the Roman soldier example. One of the things they were known for was actually functioning as a unit. Right? Your shield didn't just cover you, your shield also covered the person who was standing beside you. And I think that's worthwhile for us to consider. This book, this letter, the letter to the church at Ephesus, the book of Ephesians, we started off with talking about prayer. There's a beautiful prayer that Paul articulates at the beginning. And then it closes with prayer. It closes with Paul asking people to pray for him and to say, hey, we can pray for each other. And so I do want to draw your attention that this morning you will have been given a prayer calendar that has scripture focuses, that has people's names, and I would like to invite you into that together we're offering prayer for each other. I also would like to let you know that anytime that those of us here can pray for you, we're happy to do so. And if it would be helpful for that prayer to be like communal, for me to include that prayer within the pastoral prayer time on a Sunday morning, there are some yellow sticky notes that have been provided back on the table, and so you're welcome to do that, and then hand the sticky note to me so that I can invite others to join into prayer with you. You folks have been amazing at that. I've so much appreciated your willingness to enter into prayer. That's been a blessing for Kathy and I as we've started attending here, and so I want to thank you for that and just really affirm that.